Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Chavtet. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. We're going back and quoting the part of the Mishnah that says if someone was a relative but then they became unrelated, they can testify about each other. For example, someone has a son-in-law and then they get divorced or his daughter dies, so now they are no longer related, so they can testify about each other. Or a brother-in-law be the same thing. Rabbi Yehuda, however, disagrees and says if his daughter was married to someone and they had children together, then even if the daughter dies, they are considered relatives. In other words, he agrees if they have no kids and he dies or they get divorced, then no longer related, can testify. But if they have children, then even though the daughter died, they are related through the children, and therefore the father-in-law and that son-in-law or former son-in-law cannot testify about each other. Amar Rabbi Tanchuma, Amar Rabbi Tabla, Amar Rabbi Berona, Amar Rav. Halacha Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav thinks that halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. If they have kids, they cannot testify against each other. Rava Amar Rav Nachman, En halacha Rabbi Yehuda. Rava name Rav Nachman says we do not follow Rabbi Yehuda, and it doesn't matter even if there are kids. If there's divorce or they're not married, or one dies and they're not married anymore, so then they're not related anymore, and they can testify about each other. Also, remember this name, Rabba Bar Chana, said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda. Ika demat nila dehad Rabba Bar Chana, aha. Now, this statement that Rabba Bar Chana said the name of Rabbi Yochanan, some formulated it as we just did, that the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, and in any case of divorce or death, they can testify about each other, even if his daughter and his son-in-law had children together. But other people say that he didn't say this formulation, but rather Rabbi Yochanan said that halacha is like the following opinion. It ends up being the same thing, the same legal conclusion. It's just that he didn't say it about this statement of Rabbi Yehuda, but rather about the following statement of Rabbi Yosef, which is on a related subject. And here's what this Braita says. Etzod Rash Rabbi Yosef Galili. Ubata ela kohanim halviyim ve'ela shofet asher yeh bayamim ahem. Pasuk in Devarim says that if you don't know a law, then you should, and you need judgment, you should come to the Levitical Kohanim and to the judge that will be in that day and ask them to adjudicate your case. Now that's the pasuk. The Baraita asks, what do you mean you're going to go to the judge that's in those days? What do you think? You're going to go to a judge that's in a different days? Are you going to go into a time machine to go back in time, forward in time to a different time period? Isn't it obvious that you're going to go to a judge who lives in your own time? So what are we learning from these words? It could just say, go to the Kohanim Halvim Ela Shofet. Why do you have to add Asher Yeh Bayamim Ahem? So Rabbi Yosef says, we learned something else from this. Ela Zeh Shaya Karov V'Nitrachek. We're talking about a case where someone was a relative beforehand, but right now they're no longer a relative, like a daughter-in-law, a son-in-law. There used to be a son-in-law, and now there's not a son-in-law anymore because his daughter died. So in that case, you decide based on what's going on right now. Right now, are they related? They're not related? Okay, then they can serve as a witness or as a judge for each other, even if they used to be related. That's what we learn from this. And so you see that this halacha of Rabbi Yosef Galili is against Rabbi Yehuda, because saying across the board, even if they had children together, still, now that she died, they are no longer related. Amar Rabba Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha ke Rabbi Yosef Galili, and this is what Rabba Bar Chana said to Rabbi Yochanan. The halacha does follow Rabbi Yosef Galili. It ends up being the same thing as saying en halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. But some say that he said it about this, and some said he said it about that. But it's the same effect. Bnei chamu de Mor Ukva. And now a story about the sons of the father-in-law of Mor Ukva. In other words, Mor Ukva's brothers-in-law. Mor Ukva was the Resh Galuta. So he was a very important person, and he was a judge. They were kirobim v'nitrachaku havu. They used to be relatives, but then Mor Ukva's wife apparently died, and so now they are no longer related. Atula kamele dina. Now these former brothers-in-law, had a case to be adjudicated. They came to Mor Ukva and said, "Can you be the judge?" Amar lehu pasilna lechu ledina. He said, "No, I am disqualified for being a judge for you." So they wondered why. Amru le, my da'atech Rabbi Yehuda. What is it? Do you follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda? So let's say they had kids together. Apparently they did. Mor Ukva and his wife had children, and then she died. So the brothers-in-law said, "What, do you think that halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda? And since you had kids, therefore, even though your wife died, our sister died, still we are considered related, and you can't be a judge?" But that's not true. Anan maitinan igartad mimarava. The halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. They said, we can bring a letter from Eretz Yisrael. We just saw the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, and that halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore, even though you had children, take together with your wife, but we're no longer related. She died, and therefore you can be a judge. We do not follow Rabbi Yehuda for halacha. Amar lehu atu bekabad kira idabakna bechu. Mor Ukva said a funny phrase to them. Says, "What? You think I'm stuck to you with a big measurement of wax? Wax is sticky. You think I'm permanently stuck to you, meaning related to you? That's not why. I don't think that we are related. I don't think the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. That's not the reason that I disqualified myself. Rather, it was for a different reason. Dela ka'amina pesilna lechule dina, ela mishum dela saititu dina. I am not saying I am disqualified from judging you for legal reasons. It's not that I think we're related, but rather it's because I know you're not going to obey my verdict. I'm going to tell you something, and then you're going to say, what does he know? And so you're not going to listen to me anyway. That's why I do not want to adjudicate your case. But in fact, everybody agrees that halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda. The next part of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda continues and says, Oheb zeh shushpino. Let's look at it inside. He says, Oheb hasoneh. Rabbi Yehuda thinks that someone who is a close friend or someone who hates each other, people who hate each other, also cannot be witnesses against each other. And he defines Oheb as a groomsman and a soneh if they did not speak for 3 days. The Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and they say, no, Israel is not suspected that they're going to be a false witness because they're a close friend or because they are an enemy. It's true, they might like someone or not like someone, but they're not going to lie in testimony because of that. So now we ask, for how long is someone considered a groomsman and cannot be a witness about the other person? So Rav says for the 7 days of the wedding, from the wedding and the next 7 days during all the Sheva Berachot. Rabbanan mishmed Rava amri afilu miyom rishon va'elach. Rabbanan in the name of Rava say no, after the wedding day already he's not called a groomsman anymore. So in other words, this close friend, it's not that it's your best friend from growing up, and even if it was your best man at your wedding or your groomsman at the wedding, it doesn't mean that forever you're close friends and you can't be witnesses. Everybody agrees with that. It's a very short time period. It's talking about the wedding day itself, for sure, according to Rava. That day, if there's some kind of court case, then one cannot be a witness. And according to Rav, 7 days of the wedding celebration. That's it. That's the definition of ohev. Hasoneh kol shelo diber. Now, someone who hates each other is defined as people who did not speak to each other for 3 days because of this hatred. Tenor banan vehu lo oyeb lo yeidenu velo mbakesh ra'ato yedinenu. What's the source for this? We quote the pasuk in Bemidbar. That's defining the difference between killing someone on purpose and killing by mistake, bishogeg. So we say if it's not premeditated, he didn't hate him, it was not his enemy, he did not seek his harm before, and he just dropped the hammer on his head, then that we call that bishogeg. Now it says this a number of times in the Torah, so this is extra pesukim. So therefore the Midrash uses it to learn something else, that if someone is not an enemy from before, then he can be a witness. But if he is an enemy from before, he cannot be a witness. And he's not seeking out his harm. We learn from that if they're not seeking out his harm, then he can be a judge. But if someone is seeking harm of someone else, then he cannot be a judge for that person. Ashkechan soneh ohev b'nelan. Good. We have a source that someone who hates someone else cannot be a witness or a judge. But how about someone who is a close friend? Keri behachi vehu lo oyev lo velo oheb lo yidenu velo makesh da'ato velo tobato yedinenu. We're going to derive it from the same pasuk by adding some more words and explanations in there. When it says that he's not his enemy, and also we add, and also doesn't love him. So if it's not an enemy and also not someone who loves him, then he can be a witness. And the next part, that he's not seeking his harm, but also not seeking his favor, then he can be a judge. But if he is seeking his harm or seeking his favor, meaning if he is seeking his favor or he is someone who loves him, then he cannot be a witness or a judge. That's the derivation. We ask about that. Midi or heb ketib. Does it say that in the pasuk? I mean, I understand you can derive things. It's an extra pasuk. It's going to teach you something else. But now you're adding in the exact opposite of what the pasuk says. So this is too much of a stretch to be considered a source. Ela sevarahu. Oyeh my tama mishum demira chaka da'ateh. Rather, we're not going to derive it from extra words in the pasuk, but rather through reason. What's the reason why someone who is an enemy cannot be a judge or a witness? Because the aversion that they feel, go away, I want you to go away, I don't like you, and therefore, certainly as a judge, I would tend to rule against you. And so too, for someone who is a close friend, someone who you love, and that you have a sense of affinity for, then as a judge, you may very well judge them more kindly than is righteous, and that would not be fair. Certainly wouldn't be fair to the other party, and that's why one cannot be a judge if someone hates someone else or feels very close and loves the other person. V'Rabbanan, hay lo oyev lo velo makesh ra'ato, mai dar shebe. All that was Rabbi Yehuda. Now Rabbanan disagree with Rabbi Yehuda, and they say, oh no, people are not suspect that they're going to lie just because they hate or love someone else. So according to Rabbanan, what are they going to do with this extra pasuk? Again, we said it's extra because we know about the laws of killing someone b'shogeg from other pasukim. So what do they need this pasuk for? And the answer is had ledayan. So one of these lo oyev law, that's going to teach me the laws that we just said regarding a judge. In other words, the rabbis agree with Rabbi Yehuda that a judge cannot be someone who loves the litigant or hates the litigant. That they agree with, but they disagree regarding witness. There's a fundamental difference between them. Because a witness, he's coming and testifying about something he saw. So he's just saying some facts. So over there, we don't think that you're going to make up facts and just totally lie because this is your friend or because it's your enemy. That the rabbis don't suspect. But when you're a judge, that involves analysis, very subtle judgments, and there, the fact that you like this person or don't like this person can easily cloud your judgment. And therefore, so they agree that a judge cannot be an ohev or a soneh. So that's one of the pesukim. Idach kedetanya, amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, vehu lo oyeb lo velo makesh ra'ato, mikan lishne talmidei chachamim shesonin ze et ze she'en yoshbin badin ke'echad. And the other after the pasuk, they will use to derive this law that we learn in a Braita, where Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda says, quoting this pasuk, that we learn from here that two sages who hate each other cannot sit in judgment together. So from the first pasuk, we learn that if the judge hates or loves the litigant, they cannot be a judge. And well, we learn if we learn from the pasuk that if he hates the litigant, he cannot. By logic, we can learn also that if he loves the litigant, he cannot be a judge. And from the other half of the pasuk, we learn that even if he doesn't know the litigant, is not a friend, not an enemy of the litigant, but two of the judges hate each other, then that's going to be a problem. Because if the one of the judges comes and says, I think he's innocent, the other judge, just because he hates him, is going to contradict him and try to prove him wrong and say guilty, not because he really thinks that the guy is guilty, but only because he hates the other judge. And even if he's not doing it consciously, even subconsciously, it could cloud their judgment, and that's what the rabbis learn from this pasuk. Next Mishnah, Kesad bodkin et ha'edim. How do we examine the witnesses? The first thing we do is we bring both witnesses. If there are two witnesses, if there are more, we bring all the witnesses in, and we intimidate them. We warn them, and we say, you better not be lying, or else. The Gemara will tell us exactly what they say. And then we empty out the courtroom, and we leave only the older of the witnesses. We separate the witnesses. That way we can ask them each question separately, and then we can compare the answers to see if there are any discrepancies. And we ask them, how do you know, let's say it's a monetary case, how do you know that this person owes $1,000 to that person? Im amar hu amar li shani chayav lo. Ish peloni amar li shehu chayav lo. Lo amar kelum. Ad sheyomar befanenu hoda lo. Shehu chayav lo matayim zuz. If the witness says, the defendant admitted to me that he owes the plaintiff 200 zuz, that's not good enough. We'll see why in a second. And for sure, if the witness says, I heard from a third party, that's just hearsay. Someone told me that this guy owes that guy 200 zuz. That is not acceptable. The only thing that would be acceptable is if the witness says, the defendant admitted in front of me and the other witness, he admitted to the plaintiff, in front of the plaintiff, that he owes him 200 zuz. In other words, it has to be clear that the defendant knew that he was giving a legally binding admission. In the case of hearsay, that we just throw out, because who'd you hear it from? What does he know? And even if the defendant admitted it, but we don't know if he was serious about it. It could be just that he was saying, he wanted to show that he doesn't have a lot of money because, I don't know, he's trying to bargain when he's buying some things. Oh, I don't have a lot of money. What do you think? All this cash over here? I owe that guy 200 zuz. So he's just saying it to say that he doesn't have a lot of money, or he's joking, or, someone says, oh, you owe that guy? Yeah, I owe him. So he doesn't really mean it, just because he said it offhand. So that is not proof that he really, really owes it. Only if he comes and designates two witnesses. Says, listen, you two witnesses, I want you to stand here. And the plaintiff is there also, the other guy. And he says, listen, I want you to hear what I'm saying. I owe this person right here 200 zuz. That is an official admission. And if the witness saw that, that's acceptable testimony. But otherwise, if it's hearsay or just something that he might have said offhand, or he's joking about and didn't say it in front of the plaintiff and didn't designate witnesses, then that is not proof that he owes money. Then we bring in the second witness and we ask him the same questions and we check him out. If the statements are found to be lined up, right, they agree with each other, there's no contradictions between them. If there are contradictions, we throw it out. But if they line up, then the judges will discuss the matter. And they'll say, what do you think? Is this sufficient proof, right? Does he owe? And so on. And then they make their decision. Shenayim omerim zakai v'echad omer chayav zakai. If two people say he's exempt, and one person says he's guilty, then he's exempt. Go by the majority. Two say he's guilty, and one says he's innocent, then he's guilty. If it's 1 against 1, and the third judge doesn't vote, he says, I don't know, I'm exempting myself, I'm not voting, pass. Well, then we only have 2 judges. And that would be true even if 2 judges say he's innocent and the third one says, I don't know. Or 2 judges say guilty and the third one says, I don't know. Even in that case, you only have 2 judges. The one that says, I don't know, the one who abstains, it's as if he's not around. It's like he's not a member of a court. And you need at least 3 people on the court. So therefore, you'll have to add 2 judges. You'll go get a couple of judges from the bench, and you'll add them on, and then they vote again until they come to a majority decision. So it's kind of interesting, because if you have 2 guilty and one says innocent, he's guilty. But if two guilty and one says, I don't know, then he's not yet guilty. We have to bring more judges because you need 3 judges to vote, right? No matter how they vote. But if they don't vote, it's like they're not there at all. Gamru et hadavar hayu machnisin otan. Hagadol shebedayanin omer ish peloni ata zakai, ish peloni ata chayav. After they vote, and now they know the verdict, they bring the litigants back in. Before that, during the deliberation, the litigants are not there because you want the judges to be able to give their arguments without the litigants there so that they can say their mind. And then, once they have a verdict, they bring the litigants back in. And the greatest of the judge will announce the verdict, and he will say, so-and-so, you are exempt. So-and-so, you are liable or pay or liable, whatever it is, whatever they decided. Either they'll say that the defendant is exempt, or they'll say the defendant is liable to pay. Now, how do we know that after the court case is over, one of the judges should not go and announce and say, listen, he tells the defendant, I thought that you should be exempt. I thought you were innocent. But what can I do? The other judges said you are guilty, right? And they were the majority. You should not do that. Rather, once the judges, of course, they say their opinion in private when they're deliberating and they argue about it. But once they reach a verdict, then the court has to speak unanimously, right? The court said you are guilty. They can't go and speak about each other. How do we know that that's true? Because Pasuk says, don't be a talebearer among your people, someone who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets. So this would be saying, this judge is like throwing the other judges under the bus. He's saying, listen, I'm really your friend. I thought you were innocent. But they're the ones. They said you're guilty. You should go and hate them. No, that's not proper. There's a system here, and there's a whole court, and the court follows this procedure, and whatever they decide as a court, the court then speaks as one body. And after that, nobody needs to know who voted this way and who voted that way. The Gemara asks, Hechi amrinan lehu, what do we tell the witnesses in order to intimidate them and make sure they won't lie? Amar Rav Yehuda, Hechi amrinan lehu, nisiim veruach vegeshem ayin, ish mithalel bematat shaker. We quote to them this pasuk in Mishleh. The simple reading of the pasuk is that if you see clouds and wind without rain, that's like someone who boasts of a false gift. When you see clouds and wind, you say, oh, hooray, it's going to rain, and then the rain never comes. It's just a disappointment. So too, someone says, oh, I'm going to give you a great gift, right? It's coming soon. And he's lying. A gift never comes. You have an expectation for something good, and it never comes. So that's the same feeling. The Midrash is applying this to someone who swears falsely in a monetary item and says that the punishment of someone who speaks falsely about monetary things as a witness, the punishment will be that they will not get rain. Amar leRava, yachli lememar shab Rava says this is not scary enough because the person can say an aphorism, 7 years there was a famine, but the craftsman door, it did not pass. In other words, someone will be affected by not having rain only if they are a farmer. Not everybody's a farmer. A craftsman, he gets business all the time, even if it doesn't rain. People need their vessels to be fixed, and he's building things. And so you can say, well, I'm a craftsman. I don't care if it doesn't rain. Won't bother me. And then he'll go ahead and lie in court. Ela amar Rava, amrinan lehu mefis v'chareb v'ches shanun, ish oneh bere'ehu ayed shaker. So instead, Rava quotes a scarier pasuk, and he says, just like a hammer, a sword, and a sharp arrow that go and attack and harm people, that's the same as a person who bears false witness against his neighbor. This, you could see, is much more relevant because it's talking about being a false witness. The simple reading is that a false witness harms someone else, even though he's only saying words. It's just as harmful as shooting an arrow or hurting someone with a sword, because it could have real damage, even capital punishment. The midrashic reading is that the punishment of someone who swears falsely will be that he will be harmed by a sword or an arrow or a hammer. Amar le Rav Asher yachle lememar shab sheneh hava motana v'inish bela sheneh la shachib. But Rav Asher says, no, that's not scary enough either, because there's a folk saying that there could be 7 years of pestilence, but a person who has not reached his years will not die. In other words, some people thought that each person is destined to die at a certain date. You're destined to live a certain number of years, and therefore it doesn't matter. Even if there's danger, pestilence, sword, war, doesn't matter. A person will die when they are fated to die, no matter what. And so they're not scared. And they think that even if they do evil, still there won't be any consequences because they are destined to live a certain number of years. Ela amar Rav Asher, amar li Natan bar Mor Zutra, amrinan lehu sahade shakre aog raihu zili, tichti vehoshibu shenaim anashim, bnei Belial negdo, v'yiduhu lemor, berachta Elohim v'melech. Rav Asher says, I have a more effective way of making sure that the witnesses will not lie. And I say to them that false witnesses are belittled even by the lowlifes who hire them. Anyone who's hiring a false witness, obviously this is a crook. And you know what? The person who hires a false witness, they say, let's find some lowlife. So in other words, in the eyes of the lowlife criminals, you are considered a lowlife. Don't think that they're saying, oh, what a great person, he's helping us out. It's the criminals against the police and justice, and they think that you're a close friend. No, the people that are hiring you behind your back, they're making fun of you, saying, oh, look what a lowlife, he lies in court. How do we know that? From the story of Izebel. She hired witnesses to swear falsely against Avot so that she could take his land. And it says that she said 2 men, base fellows, Izebel, nobody more evil and horrible than Izebel. And yet, in her eyes, the false witnesses, she calls Bnei Belial, right? So get them to testify against Navot, and then you'll take his land. So this is actually less threatening than the first 2 Pesukim. We don't have to threaten the person that you're going to not have rain or that a sword will come and kill you. That person won't be so scared of. You know what a person will change his mind and not lie? Says, listen, you're not going to get any respect, not from anybody, certainly not from the judges and the people of good. Even the evil people hiring you, they're making fun of you behind your back. So that is like, I don't want to lose all my self-respect and respect from all people for doing this terrible thing. That psychological threat is more effective than a physical threat. The Mishnah continues and says, Im amar hu amar li v'chule, ad sheyomeru befanenu hodalo shehu chayav lo 200 zuz. We learned that we asked the witness, how do you know that this person owes money? And if he said, well, this guy, the defendant, admitted to me that he owes money, that's not sufficient. He has to say, this guy admitted before me and the other witness in front of the plaintiff. Has to be more official than just that, he happened to mention to me that he owes money. Mesaya le Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Sarich sheyomar atem edai. This Mishnah supports the statement of Rav Yehuda, who said in the name of Rav, that in order for admission to be effective, the defendant has to say, you are my witnesses, right? He has to say, you two, you be my witnesses right now, and I am now admitting I owe 200 zuz to this person over here. Then that is valid. Until today at a wedding, we still do this. We ask the groom to appoint 2 witnesses and say, Atem edai, you will be my witnesses to watch the kiddushin happen. Itamar nameh, amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, amar Rabbi Yochanan, maneli biadcha, amar lo hen, lemachar amar lo tenehu li, amar meshate ani becha, patur. We have another statement that supports this ruling of Rabbi Chiya bar Abba, who said named Rabbi Yochanan. If someone makes an admission, the plaintiff rather, asks a defendant the day before they come to court, the plaintiff, the claimant says, I have 100 zuz in your hand, right? Do you not agree that you owe me 100 zuz? And the defendant says, yes, I do. And then the next day they go to court. And the claimant, the plaintiff says, okay, yesterday you admitted that you owe me 100 zuz, now hand it over. And then if the defendant says, I was teasing you, I was joking, I was pulling your leg, I don't really owe you, patur, he's exempt. That's not called an official admission, because he did not go and get two witnesses and say, you are my witnesses, and I want you to officially watch that I am telling this person that I owe him 200 zuz. If he doesn't make it official like that, then on the next day in the court, he could say, I was joking. I wasn't saying a legally binding admission. Tanya Namehachi, we even have a baraita that supports this. Maneli biyadcha amar lo hen. Lemachar amar lo tenehuli. Amar lo mishatani becha patur. Baraita says the same thing. If someone goes to someone else and says, you owe me 100 zuz, right? You have 100 zuz in your possession. That's mine. You owe me 100 zuz, right? And the other guy says, yes, I do. And next day they go to court. And the plaintiff says, okay, that you just admitted yesterday that you owe me 100 zuz, now hand it over. And if the defendant says, I was joking, he's patur. Why? Again, because they did not designate witnesses. Not only that, even if the plaintiff had witnesses hiding behind the fence, and he says, you owe me $100, right? And the defendant says yes, and the witnesses are watching from behind the fence in hiding. And then the plaintiff says, would you be willing to admit that in front of these two witnesses? And he names them. And the defense says, no, I'm afraid then you're going to bring me to judgment and make me pay. And I don't want that. I do not want to make an official admission, but privately I admit to you. If that happens, and then the next day he brings him to court and says, give me the 100 maneh that you owe me, then the defendant can still say, I was joking, I was teasing you, and he doesn't have to pay. Even though there were witnesses behind the fence, and even though he said, no, I don't want to admit because I don't want to be taken to court. And so it may look like he's being serious about it, but as long as he didn't say, you are my witnesses, I want you to testify and watch that I am admitting that I owe 100 azuz to this person. If he doesn't do that, then he can always claim that he was joking the next day. The Baraita continues and says that we do not advance a claim for an inciter. Now, what are we talking about? This is someone who incites other people to worship idolatry. The judges will not help him out and give him some advice, so like, you could say this and then not be guilty. We don't help out an inciter. Okay, so before we explain what this means, the Gemara asks, Mesit, mandach shemeh, who mentioned an inciter? We were talking about monetary cases this whole time. When do you believe someone to say, I owe you $100 or not? And all of a sudden you're bringing in a case about idolatry? And the answer is, Chasure mechaserav hachikatani. The Braita is missing words. And here's how you have to understand it. Im lo ta'an en to'anin lo. When it comes to a monetary case, if the plaintiff comes and says, you told me yesterday that you admit that you owe me 100 zuz. If the defendant says, I was joking, we accept it. But if he doesn't make that claim, the judges are not going to make it for him. We're not going to go and prompt him and say, when you said that yesterday, were you joking? No, we don't feed him that claim to get him off the hook. We wait till, if he says it, we'll accept it. If he doesn't say it, then he has to pay. That's true in monetary cases where it's equal. We don't want to help one party because then that's harming the other party. The judges have to be totally fair. However, in a capital case, there the judges will help out the defendant. And if the defendant has a possible alibi, a possible claim that he could make and be innocent, but maybe he's just not thinking of it, maybe he just forgot about it, the judges will help him out. Because in a capital case, we want to be 100% sure that if we're giving the person capital punishment, that there's no possibility that he's innocent. So therefore, the judges will advance for him any possible claim to get him off the hook. It's different because it's not two parties. Even if he murdered somebody, still this is a criminal case, and we only want to kill him if, in fact, 100% he murdered. If he has some reason why he should not be killed, the judges will feed him that claim and ask him and tell him, is this true? But even though leading someone to idolatry is a capital case, this is an exception. Usually in a capital case, the judges will help out the defendant, but not if it's regarding idolatry. There, it's much more serious, and we do not help out the defendant. Now Gemara asks, how is an inciter to idolatry different from any other capital punishment? Murder should also be very serious. Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina mipirkei Rabbi Chia bar Abba shemiyali. And so Rabbi Chama bar Chanina says, I know this from the public lecture. Pirkei is a big public lecture that rabbis would give on Shabbat and special occasions of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. I learned it in this lecture, and he said, "Shaneh mesit rachamana amar lo tachmol velo techaseh alav." An inciter to idolatry is different because the pasuk says, "Do not have mercy on him. Do not cover up for him." Right, and if he's at all guilty, then we have to give him the punishment. Other people, other even capital punishment cases, we see, well, maybe he has an out, and we help them out, but not an inciter to idolatry. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Minayin she'en to'anin lamesit. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman says in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, what's the source that we know that we do not give a claim for an inciter to idolatry? Minachash hakadmoni, from the first snake, the one back in Gan Eden. Tamar Rabbi Simlai harbe ta'anot haya lo lanachash lit'on velo ta'an. Umipnei ma lo ta'an lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu lefi shelo ta'an hu. And Rabbi Simlai says an interesting derasha. The snake, he incited Chava to eat from the fruit. And when he was brought to judgment, he had a lot of claims that he could have said, and he wouldn't have gotten punished. So why didn't Hashem, who was the judge, advance claims for him and prompt him and say, well, maybe you're innocent because of this, even though he had such claims, because the snake didn't bring them up. If the snake would have made these claims, the snake would have gotten off from punishment. But since the snake did not make the claims, Hashem did not make it for him because the snake is an inciter. And now we ask, what could the snake have said to get out of punishment? He could have said, the snake could have said, if you have a student says something and the master says something, who should you listen to? Obviously the master. So the point is, God told Adam and Chava, don't eat from Etz Hada'at. So I, the simple Nachash, I'm a student. Hashem, you are the master. So Adam and Chava should have known better that they should listen to the words of Hashem and ignore the words of the snake. And so the snake says, I'm not to blame. I'm just a lowly person here. They shouldn't have listened to me. They're responsible for violating your word. I'm not responsible because they should have listened to you. They should have known better. What am I? I'm just a student here. If Nachash would have said that, then it would not have been punished. But didn't say it, so Hashem is not going to offer it on his behalf because we do not help out an inciter. Amar Chizkiya, minayin shekol hamosif goreya. Now Chizkiya says a related derasha. How do you know that sometimes when you add, you're actually taking away? Like, don't bite off more than you can chew, right? Sometimes if you try to do more, then you're going to end up getting even less. Shene'emar, amar Elohim lo tochilu mimenu velo tigeu bo. Because the pasuk says that Chava tells the snake, Hashem said, don't eat it and don't touch it. Now that's not true. Hashem only told Adam, don't eat it. He didn't say anything about touching, but apparently when Adam told Chava the law, he added to it. And he said, listen, Chava, maybe he wanted Chava to be extra careful. He added a gezerah and says, don't eat it and don't even touch it. That way she won't come to eat it. So he added. So you think adding is good, but in this case, adding ended up being worse because the snake, according to the Midrash, pushed her into it and she touched it and nothing happened. So the snake said, see, you touched it and that was against the law and nothing happened. So too, if you eat it, there will be no punishment. But in fact, all that wasn't true because she thought wrongly that touching it is not allowed. So here's a case where if you add too much more to a prohibition, and then people think, oh, look, nothing happened there when I violated the prohibition, then they'll violate the essential prohibition. And therefore, this is an example of not adding, because sometimes adding is actually taking away. Rav Meshashia says, I can learn that same lesson from the pasuk that tells us the length of the aron in the Mishkan, and it says amatayim, which means 2 cubits. Now, if you would take away the letter aleph, then it could be read as matayim, 200 cubits, which is a lot more. And so it's an example of by adding something, by adding a letter aleph to the beginning, you think adding a letter would make it more, but actually it doesn't. It makes it less. Adding the aleph turns it from 200 to 2. So that's another example of kol hamosif goreya. Rav Ashi amar ashte asre yiriot. Or another example that Rav Ashi says also from the Mishkan, says that pasuk says that there are 11 curtains. Now, if you take away the ayin, then it would say shete asre. It would say 12. So interestingly, by adding a letter, it doesn't increase the number, but actually decreases it from 12 to 11. And yet another example of adding actually makes it smaller. Amar Abaye, lo shanu ela de'amar mishate ani becha, aval amar lo hayu devarim me'olam, huchzak kafran. Abaye says this law that we've been discussing, that says that if someone admitted, yes, I owe you 100 zuz today, and there were witnesses hiding, and then they come to court tomorrow, and then the plaintiff said, hey, you admitted yesterday that you owe me 100 zuz. The defendant can say, I was only joking, and he doesn't have to pay. That's true. However, that's only if he says, I was joking. But if he says, no, that never happened, I never admitted it, right? He denies the occurrence altogether, then that he is not believed. We assume that he is someone who is falsely denying, because after all, there are witnesses that heard his admission. So he can't just deny that he admitted. He definitely did admit. If he explains the admission as a joke, okay, then that was his intention. He didn't officially recognize the witnesses. He didn't say atem aidai. They were hiding witnesses, and therefore he was thinking, oh, this is not going to be serious. I'll just say, yeah, I owe you $100 just to get the guy off his back, but he didn't mean it. But if he says it never happened, well, then he's just a liar. Amarav papa b'red Rav Acha bar Ada hachi amrina mishme derava kol mile dichidi la dechiri inashe. Rav Papa, the son of Rav Acha, the son of Ada, disagrees with Abaye because he says in the name of Rava, any matter that is kedi, frivolous, a person doesn't remember. A person doesn't remember every joke they made, every offhanded comment. A person will remember if a serious thing that they said, a legal admission. Yes, a person will remember. But if a person is joking around, yeah, whatever, I owe you $100, right? See you later. Then the person's not going to remember. And therefore, if the defendant comes to court and says, I don't know what you're talking about, I never admitted to you, he might actually not remember because he was joking around. And therefore, according to Rava, if the plaintiff said the day before, you owe me 100, right? And he said, yeah, whatever, with hiding witnesses, and next day comes to court and says, I don't know what you're talking about, I never admitted that, he is believed. Not that is true, but that is true that he doesn't remember that it happened, because a person may forget an offhanded comment that they made, and therefore he does not have to pay, no matter whether he says, I was joking, or that never happened. And now some stories. Someone hid witnesses in the canopy above his bed. Like a canopy bed, you have a section on top. The witnesses, he's told, put the witnesses there, he says, be quiet. The plaintiff tells the defendant, hey, you owe me $100, right? He says, yes, I do. The plaintiff says, let those awake and those asleep bear witness to you. In other words, they're in a bedroom, so maybe there's someone sleeping. Now he is tricking the defendant because he thinks that the defendant thinks there's nobody in the room, and the defendant will say, yeah, fine, okay, let anybody who's here awake or sleeping be witnesses, and not knowing that there actually are witnesses, he would thereby be appointing the witnesses. However, the defendant did not agree. He said, no, I do not agree to testify in front of any witnesses who might be here, sleeping or awake. So what's the law? Amar Rav Kahana, ha'amad le'la. Rav Kahana said, well, the defendant said no. He's not willing to admit it in front of witnesses, and therefore, there is no admission here. He can come to court the next day and say, no, I was joking. Another time, they were walking around in the cemetery and chatting, and the plaintiff hid witnesses in the cemetery somewhere. Amar le'hen, he says, oh, you owe me $100, right? Amar le'hen, yes, I do. The plaintiff says, let the living and the dead bear witness to what you said, right? Would you agree to that? Now, from the defendant's perspective, it seems that there's nobody around in the cemetery. So maybe he would agree, but he did not. Amar leila, no, I do not agree to testify in front of witnesses, even if they're dead. Amar Rabbi Shimon, Amar leila, Rabbi Shimon says, since the defendant said no, he's not willing to testify in front of witnesses, so that's not a valid admission. And therefore, when he comes to court the next day, he can say, I was just joking. Amar Rav Papa, Shema mina meha, ha de Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Sarich she'amar atem edai, la shena ki amar love, la shena ki amar malve, v'shatik love, tamad amar love la. Aval ish shatik hachina me. Ravinat, some say Rav Papa says, we can learn from these stories regarding the halacha that Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav, that in order for an admission to be official, someone has to say, you are my witnesses. Well, that would be true whether it's the borrower who says, you are my witnesses. That would be typical because the borrower is the one making the admission that says, I owe you 100 zuz. So if he appoints the witnesses and says, you are my witnesses, for sure that's a valid admission. And not only that, also if the malveh says, listen, I want you to admit to me that you owe me $100, and here are the two witnesses over here. If the loveh, the borrower, doesn't say anything, he doesn't object to it, and he says, yes, I owe you, well then, that also is a valid admission. So we can learn from these stories that the only reason why it's not an admission is because the loveh said, no, I do not agree to be on record. I do not want any witnesses to hear what I have to say. I'm not saying it in front of witnesses. So he has to specifically object. But if he did not object and he was only quiet, then indeed, those witnesses that the malveh said, oh, do you agree? The malveh said, I agree. I'm appointing these witnesses. The loveh didn't say anything, but he admitted in front of them that also officially would be an admission that would be reliable in court. Another interesting story. There was a person, his name was a kav of debts. Kav is a big measurement. This guy owed so many people money. They called him a big bundle of debts. Amar man masik bi ela peloni upeloni. But this guy denied it most of the time. And then one time he said, who can claim anything against me except for Mr. A and Mr. B? I only owe these two people money. Everybody else, I don't owe them anything. So those two people, Mr. A and Mr. B, they brought him to court to Rav Nachman because he just admitted that he owes them money. Amar Rav Nachman, Adam asui shelo lehasbiya et asmo. Rav Nachman did not make this guy pay because he said a person is prone to not make himself look sated, not make himself look wealthy. Some people boast how wealthy they are, even if they're not wealthy. But some people are the opposite. Even if they have money, they tell everybody, no, I'm poor, I have debts, I owe this guy money, I owe that guy money, maybe because they don't want to pay anyone, or maybe because they're trying to negotiate when they're buying some land and they don't want to make it look like they are rich. And so therefore, since a person is likely to make himself not look sated, he is likely to lie and say, I owe this guy and that guy money, but it wasn't in front of witnesses that he appointed, and therefore it's not a legal admission. A similar story about someone who people called a mouse that sits on coins. He's a miser, and he just collected and didn't like to spend any money. When he was on his deathbed, he said, Mr. A and Mr. B, they have a valid claim against me. I owe them money. So after the guy died, then Mr. and Mr. B came to the heirs to collect that money. He says, your father admitted that he owes us money. Atule kamed Rabbi Ishmael Rabbi Yosef Amar lehu ki amrinan adam asur shelo le'asbiya et asmo hanemi lemechayim aval achar mita la. So they came to judgment to Rabbi Ishmael Rabbi Yosef, and he said, when we say that rule that a person is likely to make himself not look rich and say, I owe money, that's only when he's alive and well. But when someone is on his deathbed, what reason would he have to say that? And therefore, we believe his admissions and we take them seriously, and he has to pay. The heirs now have to pay Mr. A and Mr. B. So the heirs paid half of the amount. Mr. and Mr. B came back and sued him for the other half that they never paid. And this time Rabbi Chia was the judge. Et asmo kachadam asui shelo lehasbia et banav. He had a different opinion. He said, just like a person is likely to make himself not look rich, he also is likely to make his sons not look rich. He doesn't want people to all of a sudden come after his heirs and they say, oh, did you hear that this person died? And now the heirs are so rich, people are going to come after him and try to take money from him, try to get collections or whatever. And so it's not good for the heirs. So a person is likely to lie on his deathbed and say, although it looks like I have a lot of money, I owe this guy money, I owe that guy money, I really don't have a lot. And that way, his heirs will not look rich. A person would lie, and therefore Mr. and Mr. B have no claim against the heirs. So Rabbi Chia did not make the heirs pay the other half. And now the heirs say, we want the first half that we paid, we want it back, because now that you ruled that someone is apt to lie on his deathbed, that means that Mr. and Mr. B never had proof, never had a legal admission in the first place, so we should actually be paid back the half that we already paid. Amar lehu kevad horazaken. However, Rabbi Chia said no. The elder, Rabbi Ishmael, the son of Rabbi Yosef, he already issued a verdict, and he said you have to pay half. So that's it. The half that you already paid is a valid ruling. I'm not going to overturn the old ruling, but from here on in, I say that you don't have to pay the other half. הודה בפני שניים וקנו מידו כותבין ואם לאו אין כותבין. So now another halacha. Let's say someone made an admission in front of witnesses. Okay, now we finally dealt with the witnesses, and furthermore, they made a formal acquisition. It did some kind of kinyan. The person admitting that he owes money did a kinyan. If he actually does a formal act, then the witnesses can even write up a document that says, before us, this guy admitted that he owes 100 zuz. However, if they did not make a formal acquisition, then the witnesses can not write it up in a document. Because although, yes, they can come to court and testify, this guy admitted and he will have to pay, but the defendant may want it to remain as an oral loan and not be a written document. If you make a formal acquisition, then that means it's basically like you already gave it over by making some kind of acquisition. So then they can actually write it up, and it has the status of a written loan, in which case you can even collect from land. If he did not make a formal acquisition, then it's only an oral loan. Bifnei shelosha velo kanu miyado Rav Ameh Amar kotvin v'Rav Aseh Amar en kotvin. Let's say the defendant, the person that's going to pay money, made an admission not in front of two witnesses but in front of three people and did not make a formal acquisition. Rav Ameh says the three people can write it up in a document because three people is now like a court, and if you make an admission in front of a bet din, then the bet din can write it up. Whereas Rav Aseh says, no, not necessarily. Maybe he just said the three people will be like witnesses, and he did not intend for the three people to actually be a court. Hava obada v'chash la Rav lehad Rav Aseh. There was a case where exactly this happened, and Rav ruled in accordance with Rav Aseh, meaning that they did not write up the document because maybe the person did not want it to be a court. Amar Rav Ada bar Ava ha'odita zimnin katvin ve'zimnin la katvin. Rav Ada bar Ava says regarding an admission, sometimes we write it up and sometimes we don't write it up. What does it depend on? If there were three people, they were sitting there ready and gathered, and then this guy comes and says, I want to make an admission, I owe that guy $100. In that case, we do not write it up, because it's not clear that he wanted it to be a court. They were already gathered and sitting there. But if the person that's making the admission specifically gathers the people together, says, come over here, you sit here, right? And puts the three people there, then it's evident that he does want it to be a court. And then after he makes the admission, they can write it up in a document. Rava amar afilu kanfinhu ihu la katvinhu ad amar lehu heve alai dayana. Rava, however, says even if the person making the admission gathered them together specifically, nevertheless, we do not write it. See, each step is getting more and more requirements until he says, you be my judges. Because how do you know? Just because he gathered them, maybe he may just gathered them as witnesses. So only if he says, you be my judges, then they are a betin, and then they can write it up. Mor barav ashe amar, afilu amar hevu alai dayana, la katvinan ad kab'i duchta v'shalchi umezameni lebedina. Mor barav ashe says, even if the person make the admission says, I want you to be my judges, they do not write it up unless they set a place for it, a place of judgment, and the judges send messengers and summon the relevant people to court. Then that means it's really official. But if they doesn't do that, then they don't write it up. Now, as we said before, if someone makes an admission that I owe you some movable item, right? I have to give you this bicycle, and they make a kinyan. Well, then they write it up, as we said before, because they made a formal acquisition. Vim lav and kotvim, without a formal acquisition, the admission just remains oral. They don't write it. The question is, what about if he makes an admission regarding land? I admit I owe you this amount of land. They did not make a formal acquisition. What about in that case? Is it the same law or not? Amad and Kotvin Amad says it's the same law. We do not write it up unless they make an act of acquisition. Mozutra Amad Kotvin, Mozutra says we do write it up, and the halacha is that we do write it up, and that the reason is because land is always just sitting there. It's ready and waiting for the rightful owner to come and take it. Unlike metal telin, that can move around, it can get lost, and who knows if it's even around to be collected. So therefore, if one, according to Mozutra, if someone makes an admission, I owe you land, then even without a formal acquisition, the witnesses can write it up in a document. Ravina ikla le dam hariya. One time Ravina went to this place called dam hariya. Amar le Rav Dimi bar Rav Huna mi dam hariya le Ravina. And Rav Dimi, the son of Rav Huna, who lived in dam hariya, asked Ravina, took the opportunity to ask him a question when he came. Metaltele ve'itnehu be'aynayhu mai. What if someone makes an admission, I owe you a bicycle, and the bicycle is here. It's extant. We know where it is. Would that be like land? Amar le kemekarka edamu. And Ravina says, yeah, it's the same as land, because it's the same thing. Just like land is here, waiting, ready to be collected by the rightful owner. So too, if the bicycle is right here, it has the same law, and they can, well, whatever you say about that, according to Mozutra, and since halacha is like that you can write it, then the same would be for a movable item that exists and is in front of us. Rav Ashe amar kevan de mechasseri gubayna la. Rav Ashe says, no, it's not the same, even though the bike is here, but since it has not been collected, not physically transferred, and no act of acquisition has been done, then it's not the same as land, and we do not write a document about it. Hahi odita de lahava katuba amar lana kitvu vechitmu vahavu le. Abaye v'Ravad amre tarvayu haynu deresh lakish. Let's say you have a document of admission, and usually the standard formula is that they should write in the document of admission that this person, the one making the admission, told us, the witnesses, that we should write it and sign it and give it to the other party so that he can use to collect. Now, let's say you have a document of admission, but it's missing this line. Is it still valid? Abay and Rava both say that, Oh, we know the answer. It depends on what Resh Lakish said. It's the same law. Tamar Resh Lakish, Hazaka en ha'edim chotmin al ashtar, ela im ken na'asa gadol. Resh Lakish said in a related case that we have a chazakah, we have a presumption that witnesses do not sign on a document unless the litigants, the people involved, are adults. In other words, if someone claims, "Oh no, I was just a child when I did that, so it's not valid." No, if there's two people named in a document, and it says, this person lent money to that, bought something from that person, then we can assume that that person is an adult because the witnesses otherwise would not have written up the document and would not have signed it if it was an invalid transaction. And we can apply the same principle here, that the witnesses would not have written up the document of admission unless it was under proper circumstances, which means unless the person making the admission asked them to specifically to go write it up and sign it. So even though that's usually supposed to be in the document, if they forgot to put that line in, we assume nevertheless that it is valid and he did tell them to write it up. מתקיף לה רב פאפי, ויתמה רב הונא ברד רב יהושע. מי כמידי דאנן לה ידעינן וספרי דבית דינה ידעי. Rab Papi, and some say Rav Huna Bere, the son of Rav Yoshua, object to this. And they say, is there could it be that there's something that we don't know? We're sages. We never heard this law. And the scribes of the court would know it. The scribes of the court, they know how to write. I mean, they're experts in their profession, but they're not necessarily great sages. And so we never heard this. So it doesn't make sense that the scribes would know this. And therefore, how can you trust that the scribes would not write up a document unless everything was in order? Maybe they would because they don't know this, and the scribes would just write it up. And you can't assume this chazakah that they would not write up a document unless everything was valid. So they went and asked, She'elinhu l'safrei d'Abaye v'yad'eh l'safrei d'Rabba v'yad'eh. So they asked the scribes that worked for Abaye, and they knew this law, and they asked the scribes that worked for Rabba, and they also knew the law. So you see, that's their profession. So they know what they're doing. They know all the relevant halachot, and sometimes they even know the halachot about their profession even better than some of the sages. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.